Hey friends, tonight we drift quietly into the candlelit corners of history, past the Colosseums and Senate halls, into the spaces where people whispered, touched, and wanted. You've likely heard the rumors of Roman orgies and emperors with endless appetites, but the truth is stranger, quieter, and sometimes much sadder than the stories. So dim your lights, breathe deep, let me know what time it is for you and where you're listening from, and let's take a soft walk through the private lives of ancient Rome. No judgment, no rush, just history at its most human. Before we begin this gentle journey together, take a moment to get comfortable. Pull that blanket a little closer. Let your shoulders drop. We're going to move slowly tonight, like archaeologists carefully brushing dust from delicate artifacts, because that's what we're doing, really uncovering the tender, complicated truths that time has tried to bury. The Romans left us letters, graffiti scratched into walls, poetry that makes your heart ache 2,000 years later. And through these whispers from the past, we can piece together what it was really like to love, to desire, to be human in a world so different from ours, yet somehow exactly the same. So breathe with me, in and out. Let's begin. Picture this, if you will, a modest apartment in Rome, sometime around 100 AD. Oil lamps flicker against terracotta walls. The sounds of the city, cartwheels on stone, distant laughter, a neighbor's baby crying, drift through shuttered windows. And in this small, warm space, two people find each other at the end of a long day. This is where most Roman intimacy actually happened, not in marble palaces or elaborate bathhouses, but in ordinary homes, between ordinary people who worked hard, worried about money, and fell asleep holding each other. The Romans were surprisingly practical about physical love. They saw it as natural, necessary even, like eating or sleeping. But they also understood something we sometimes forget, that true intimacy requires patience, tenderness, and time. There's a beautiful piece of graffiti from Pompeii that simply says, "If you want to know what love is, ask the wind. It's the only thing that touches everything." Anonymous words scratched into a wall by someone who understood that desire isn't just about bodies, it's about connection, about being seen and known. Romans courted each other with poetry and small gifts. The perfectly ripe hair, a lock of hair tied with ribbon, letters written on thin sheets of bark, meant to be read once and then burned, keeping secrets safe. Young men would sometimes hire professional letter writers to help express their feelings. These scribes, often Greek slaves with beautiful handwriting, would craft tender words. "When I see you in the marketplace, time stops. When you're away, the sun forgets to shine." Simple words, but they carried the weight of genuine longing. Roman women, despite what history books sometimes suggest, had more romantic agency than we might expect. They could refuse marriages, initiate relationships, and express their desires through subtle signals, a particular way of arranging their hair, a glance held just a moment too long, a flower left on a windowsill. Take your time with this image, a young woman named Claudia, perhaps, sitting by her window in the late afternoon light, carefully composing a response to a suitor. Her stylus moves slowly across the wax tablet, each word chosen with care. "Your letter made me smile," she writes. "Come to the Temple of Venus tomorrow at sunset. I'll be wearing the blue cloak you admired." Most Romans married young and stayed married. Divorce existed, but it was complicated, expensive, and socially difficult, so couples learned to grow together, to adapt, to find contentment in the everyday rhythms of shared life. Roman marriage wasn't built on our modern notion of passionate romance. It was more like a slow dance. Partners learning each other's steps, finding their rhythm, creating something beautiful through patience and practice. The Romans had a lovely wedding tradition. The bride and groom would plant a tree together on their wedding day, then tend it together throughout their marriage. As the tree grew, so did their bond. Some of these trees, incredibly, still stand today in Italian courtyards, silent witnesses to loves that began 2,000 years ago. Roman spouses wrote to each other constantly, even when living in the same house. Little notes left on pillows, tucked into lunch baskets, hidden in jewelry boxes. Thank you for finding my lost earring. The way you smiled at dinner made my heart race. I dreamed of you last night. These tiny acts of tenderness built intimacy more surely than grand gestures ever could. But we can't paint Roman intimacy in only gentle colors. The truth is more complex, more human, and sometimes more painful. Roman society was built on hierarchy, and this affected the most private moments. Slaves had no right to refuse their masters. Women, even wealthy ones, had limited legal autonomy. What might look like romance to us sometimes masked relationships built on power imbalances we can barely comprehend. Yet even in these dark spaces, we find evidence of genuine affection. Letters between masters and slaves that hint at real emotional bonds. Inscriptions on tombstones where wealthy Romans grieved deeply for servants they'd clearly loved. The human heart, it seems, has always been capable of transcending the social structures that try to contain it. Roman poetry is full of heartbreak, men and women writing about lost loves, missed opportunities, the peculiar loneliness of being surrounded by people, yet feeling utterly alone. Ovid, exiled from Rome, wrote, "Love is a temporary madness. It erupts like an earthquake, then subsides. And when it subsides, you have to make a decision. You have to work out whether your roots have become so intertwined that you are, for better or worse, one person." These words, written 2,000 years ago, still make us pause, still make us nod in recognition, because longing and loss and the complicated dance of human connection, these things haven't changed. Romans talked about physical intimacy more openly than many cultures that followed. They had detailed manuals. Think of them as ancient relationship guides that discussed not just technique, but emotional connection, how to read your partner's needs, how to give pleasure as well as receive it, how to communicate without words. These weren't crude texts, but gentle guides that emphasized mutual respect and care. Listen to your lover's breathing, one manual advised. Watch their face. Love is a conversation, not a monologue. Roman baths were places where couples could relax together, massage each other's tired muscles, share quiet conversations in the warm water. The wealthy had private baths in their homes, but even ordinary Romans visited public baths that had sections for couples, dimly lit pools where partners could reconnect after long days apart. There's something deeply moving about imagining these scenes. Tired hands being gently massaged, quiet laughter echoing off marble walls, the simple pleasure of warm water and beloved company after a difficult day. In 79 AD, Vesuvius erupted and buried Pompeii in ash, but in freezing that moment, it also preserved something precious, the most intimate evidence of how Romans really loved. Among the ruins, archaeologists found love letters that were never sent, graffiti scratched into bedroom walls, personal objects placed carefully in shrines dedicated to Venus, the goddess of love. These weren't grand historical documents, but the everyday artifacts of people who loved, lost, hoped, and dreamed. One letter, found in a sealed jar, was written by a soldier to his wife. "My beloved Julia, I count the days until I can hold you again. I've saved money to buy you the silk scarf you admired. When I come home, let's walk to the vineyard where we first kissed. I want to make new memories to carry with me if I'm sent away again." He never returned. The letter was never sent. But somehow, across 2 millennia, his love reaches us, still tender, still real, still capable of making us pause and remember that the human heart has always been the same. Not all Roman relationships fit the traditional patterns. The empire was vast, diverse, and more sexually fluid than many periods that followed. Same-sex relationships existed, were often accepted, and sometimes even celebrated. The Emperor Hadrian's love for Antinous is one of history's most famous same-sex relationships. When Antinous died young, Hadrian's grief was so profound that he founded cities in his lover's honor, commissioned thousands of statues, and created a cult of worship around his memory. It was love as devotion, love as art, love as a force that could reshape the world. Roman women sometimes formed deep partnerships with each other, while the legal system didn't recognize these relationships. Letters and poetry suggest they were emotionally rich and lasting. "You are my true companion," wrote one woman to another. "In your arms, I find peace." These relationships remind us that human connection has always found ways to flourish, even in societies that didn't always understand or accept it. Asterisk tonight, we begin our gentle journey into the heart of ancient Rome, not through the marble columns of the Forum or the roar of the Colosseum, but through the quiet spaces where people loved, desired, and navigated the complex web of law and longing that shaped their most intimate moments. Take a deep breath with me, and let's step softly into a world where passion was both celebrated and constrained, where the heart's desires met the rigid structures of empire. The Romans approached physical desire with a fascinating mixture of openness and control. Unlike many cultures that would follow, they didn't view the body or its pleasures as inherently shameful. Sexual desire was seen as natural, as fundamental to human nature as hunger or thirst. Roman poets wrote openly about longing, about the ache of wanting someone who might not return their affections. Ovid, in his Art of Love, didn't hide behind metaphors when he described the electric moment when lovers first touch. Catullus wrote verses that would make modern readers blush, yet these weren't considered scandalous or inappropriate. They were simply honest expressions of human experience, but this openness existed within carefully defined boundaries. Roman society was built on hierarchies, on clear distinctions between citizen and slave, between men and women, between the powerful and the powerless. These hierarchies didn't disappear in the bedroom. They shaped every aspect of intimate life, determining who could desire whom, who could refuse advances, and who held the power to make choices about their own bodies. The Roman understanding of desire was inseparable from their understanding of power, status, and social order. Picture, if you will, a typical Roman home in the 1st century AD. The walls are painted with frescoes that celebrate love and beauty. Venus, The goddess of love watches over the household from her place of honor in the lararium, the family shrine. The master of the house, a Roman citizen, moves through spaces where his word is law. His wife, though she may come from a wealthy family, exists in a legal limbo where her desires and choices are filtered through his authority. The slaves who serve them have even fewer rights, their bodies subject to their master's will in ways that would horrify us today. This was the world where Roman attitudes toward passion developed. It was a world where a man could write beautiful poetry about his undying love for his wife, yet also maintain relationships with slaves and prostitutes without social condemnation. It was a world where women of the upper classes could wield enormous influence through their beauty and charm, yet remained legal minors throughout their lives, always under the authority of father, husband, or male guardian. Asterisk. The Romans had a complex vocabulary for different types of love and desire. Amor was passionate, consuming love, the kind that made poets stay awake, writing verses by lamplight. Caritas was the deep affection between family members, the steady love that held households together. Libido was purely physical desire, acknowledged as natural, but requiring careful management. And then there was pietas, the sense of duty and devotion that was supposed to govern all relationships, including marriage. These weren't just words. They represented different ways of understanding and experiencing human connection. Roman marriages, particularly among the wealthy classes, were carefully orchestrated affairs that had little to do with the romantic love we might expect today. Picture a young Roman woman, perhaps 16 years old, sitting in her father's atrium as he discusses her future with the father of a potential suitor. She might not even be present for these negotiations. Her dowry, her family's political connections, the business advantages that might result from the union. These were the factors that mattered. Her personal feelings, her physical attraction to her future husband, her dreams for her own life. These were secondary considerations at best. Yet within these arranged marriages, genuine affection often bloomed. Roman tombstones are filled with touching inscriptions from husbands mourning beloved wives, from wives praising husbands who had been kind and gentle partners. The poet Pliny the Younger wrote letters to his wife Calpurnia that radiate with tender affection. He worried about her health, missed her when they were apart, and clearly delighted in her company. These weren't the words of a man trapped in a loveless arrangement, but of someone who had found real happiness within the constraints of his society. The legal framework that governed Roman marriages was both complex and revealing. Under Roman law, there were different types of marriages with different legal implications. Cum manu marriage meant that the wife passed from her father's authority to her husband's, becoming legally equivalent to his daughter. Sine manu marriage allowed the wife to remain under her father's legal authority, giving her slightly more independence. But in both cases, the woman herself had limited agency. She could not initiate divorce proceedings in early Roman law, could not control her own property, and could not make legal decisions about her children. Asterisk. These legal restrictions shaped the most intimate aspects of married life. A Roman husband had the legal right to control his wife's movements, to determine whom she could see and where she could go. He could demand sexual access as part of his marital rights. If she committed adultery, he could legally kill both her and her lover. Yet if he sought pleasure elsewhere, as most Roman men did, this was considered normal and acceptable behavior. The double standard wasn't hidden or apologized for. It was built into the very structure of Roman law. But law and lived experience don't always align perfectly. Many Roman wives found ways to exercise influence and make choices within these constraints. They formed alliances with other women, created networks of support and information. They used their roles as mothers to shape their sons' attitudes toward women. They found ways to express their desires and preferences, even when they couldn't enforce them legally. Some Roman women became powerful figures in their own right, advising emperors, patronizing artists, and influencing political decisions. They did this not by challenging the legal framework directly, but by working skillfully within it. The question of consent in Roman marriage was complicated by these legal realities. A Roman bride had little choice about whom she married or when, yet once married, the relationship often evolved into something more mutual and affectionate. Roman writers described the ideal marriage as one where husband and wife were companions, where they shared interests and supported each other's goals. The younger Pliny praised his wife not just for her beauty, but for her intelligence, her interest in his work, and her ability to manage their household efficiently. Roman attitudes toward physical pleasure within marriage were surprisingly sophisticated. Medical texts from the period discuss the importance of mutual satisfaction, the need for patience and tenderness, and the recognition that women, as well as men, had physical desires that deserved consideration. The Roman writer Lucretius wrote about the importance of emotional connection in physical relationships, arguing that true satisfaction came not just from physical gratification, but from the meeting of minds and hearts. Yet these ideals existed alongside practices that would appall us today. Roman law gave husbands virtually unlimited authority over their wives' bodies. A husband could demand sexual access whenever he chose, regardless of his wife's feelings or physical condition. He could punish her for refusing him, could restrict her movements if he suspected infidelity, could even sell her into slavery in extreme cases. The legal system that supposedly protected marriage actually created conditions where abuse was not only possible, but legally sanctioned. The Romans also maintained a complex system of concubinage that existed parallel to marriage. A concubine was a woman who lived with a man in a relationship that resembled marriage but lacked legal recognition. This arrangement was common among men who couldn't afford the dowry required for legal marriage or who wanted to maintain relationships with women of lower social status. Concubines had no legal rights, no protection if their partner decided to end the relationship, and no claim on their children's inheritance. Yet some of these relationships were stable and affectionate, lasting for decades and producing children who were loved and cared for, even if they couldn't inherit their father's name or property. The legal framework also shaped relationships between masters and slaves in ways that profoundly affected Roman intimate life. Roman law was clear. A slave had no right to refuse their master's sexual advances. Slaves could be bought and sold specifically for sexual purposes, could be forced into prostitution, could be made to bear children who would also be slaves. Yet within this brutal system, some relationships developed genuine affection. Masters sometimes freed slave concubines and married them, elevating them to legal status. Some Roman tombstones commemorate beloved slaves who had clearly been more than just property to their owners. The morality laws that governed Roman sexual behavior were full of contradictions and double standards. The Lex Julia de Adulteris, passed by Augustus, made adultery a public crime rather than a private family matter, but it applied only to married women and their lovers, not to married men. A Roman man could have relationships with prostitutes, slaves, and unmarried women without legal consequences. A Roman woman who strayed from her marriage faced exile, confiscation of property, and social ruin. The law supposedly protected the sanctity of marriage, but it did so by controlling women's sexuality while leaving men free to pursue their desires. These laws reflected deeper Roman anxieties about female sexuality and social order. Romans feared that uncontrolled female desire would lead to chaos, to uncertainty about paternity, to the breakdown of the family structures that held society together. They channeled these fears into legal restrictions that severely limited women's sexual autonomy. Yet at the same time, Roman culture celebrated female beauty and charm, created goddesses who embodied sexual power, and produced art that glorified women's sensuality. The enforcement of these morality laws was often arbitrary and politically motivated. Emperors who wanted to appear virtuous might crack down on adultery, but the same laws were ignored when it was convenient. Wealthy and powerful Romans could often escape consequences through bribery or political influence. The laws existed more as statements of ideal behavior than as practical guides to daily life. As we settle deeper into this exploration of Roman intimate life, we begin to see how law and desire created a complex dance of constraint and freedom, of public morality and private reality. Roman society found ways to celebrate passion while controlling it, to honor love while subordinating it to larger social goals. The tensions between these competing values played out in every Roman bedroom, in every marriage negotiation, in every moment when personal desire met social expectation. Asterisk. The Romans left us a rich record of how they navigated these tensions. Their letters reveal marriages that began as business arrangements but grew into loving partnerships. Their poetry captures the ache of forbidden desire and the joy of sanctioned love. Their legal documents show us the framework within which all these human emotions had to operate. Together, these sources paint a picture of a society that was both more open and more restrictive than our own, where the boundaries between public and private, between law and love, were drawn in ways that seem foreign to us today. Asterisk. In the quiet hours of a Roman night, when the oil lamps flickered low and the sounds of the city faded to whispers, people found ways to love and be loved within the constraints of their time. They wrote letters that would survive 2,000 years, carved inscriptions on tombstones that still move us to tears, and created art that celebrates the enduring power of human connection. Their world was governed by laws that seem harsh to us, by social conventions that limited freedom in ways we can barely imagine. Yet within these constraints, they found ways to express the full range of human emotion, to build relationships that sustained them through the challenges of life in the ancient world. As we continue our journey through the intimate lives of ancient Romans, we'll explore how these legal and social frameworks shaped every aspect of personal relationships, from the wedding chamber to the slave quarters, from the houses of the wealthy to the apartments of the poor. We'll see how people found ways to love and desire and connect, even within systems that sought to control their most personal choices. And we'll discover that the human heart, in all its complexity and contradiction, remains remarkably constant across the centuries. Let these images settle gently in your mind as we prepare to explore deeper into the Roman world. Picture the young bride, nervous but hopeful, as she enters her new husband's house. Imagine the slave woman, powerless yet perhaps loved, as she navigates the dangerous waters of her master's desire. Think of the Roman matron, legally constrained but socially powerful, as she shapes the world around her through intelligence and charm. These were real people, with real feelings, real hopes, and real fears. Their stories, preserved in stone and parchment and memory, remind us that love and law have always existed in tension, that the human desire for connection has always found ways to flourish, even in the most challenging circumstances. Sleep peacefully tonight, knowing that across the centuries, people have always found ways to love and be loved, to desire and be desired, to create meaning and beauty in their most intimate moments. The Romans, for all their contradictions and complexities, understood something important about the human heart, that it cannot be entirely controlled by law or custom, that it will always find ways to express itself, and that the connections between people, however constrained by their circumstances, remain the most powerful force in human experience. Chapter 2, Marital Intimacy. As we continue our gentle journey through the private chambers of ancient Rome, we now turn our attention to the most sanctioned form of physical connection in Roman society, marriage. But as we'll discover together in the soft glow of history's candlelight, Roman marital intimacy was a complex tapestry woven from duty, expectation, and the quiet negotiations that happen between two people sharing a bed, a home, and a life shaped by forces far beyond their control. The Roman wedding night was not the romantic beginning we might imagine today. Picture, if you will, a young Roman bride, perhaps no more than 14 or 15 years old, sitting in her new husband's house as the last wedding guest departed into the night. She has been prepared for this moment by her mother and the older women of her family, but their preparation focused more on duty than on pleasure, more on endurance than on joy. The flickering oil lamps cast dancing shadows on the walls as she waits, her heart beating with a mixture of fear and resignation that was considered perfectly natural and appropriate for a Roman wife. Her husband, often significantly older, approaches this moment with his own set of expectations shaped by Roman law and custom. He has been taught that his wife's body is his right, that her primary purpose is to bear his children and manage his household. The concept of mutual pleasure, of tender exploration, of the kind of intimate communication that builds lasting physical and emotional bonds, these ideas were not entirely absent from Roman thought, but they were secondary to the more pressing concerns of procreation and social stability. The Romans approached marital sexuality with a practical mindset that could seem almost clinical to our modern sensibilities. Medical texts from the period describe the act of conception in terms that sound more like agricultural manuals than guides to intimate connection. The husband was expected to plant his seed efficiently and effectively. The wife was expected to receive it with quiet acceptance and to nurture it into the sons who would carry on the family name and inherit the family wealth. This transactional view of marital intimacy shaped everything from the timing of sexual encounters to the positions considered appropriate for married couples. Roman physicians and philosophers wrote extensively about the best conditions for conception, creating elaborate guidelines that governed when and how married couples should come together. They believed that a woman's emotional state during conception would influence the character of her future child, so wives were counseled to approach the marriage bed with calm acceptance rather than passion or desire. The ideal Roman wife was supposed to be a vessel for her husband's seed, not a partner in mutual pleasure. This emphasis on procreation over pleasure had profound implications for how Roman couples experienced physical intimacy. Sexual encounters were often timed to coincide with what Romans believed were the most fertile periods of a woman's cycle. The focus was on efficiency and effectiveness, rather than on building emotional connection or providing mutual satisfaction. Many Roman wives learned to view their marital duties as just that, duties to be performed with grace and dignity, but not necessarily with enthusiasm or personal fulfillment. The age differences that characterized many Roman marriages added another layer of complexity to these intimate relationships. It was common for Roman girls to be married soon after puberty, often to men who were decades older. A 14-year-old bride might find herself married to a man in his 30s or 40s, someone who had already lived a full adult life while she was still a child. These age gaps created power imbalances that extended far beyond the legal and social structures we discussed earlier. In the most private moments of marriage, a young wife might find herself with a husband who was more father figure than romantic partner. Picture a typical Roman household in the evening hours. The master of the house, a man of perhaps 35 years, has spent his day in the forum, conducting business, arguing legal cases, or managing his estates. His wife, barely 20, has spent her day overseeing the household slaves, weaving cloth, and tending to their young children. When they retire to their private chambers, they bring with them not just the physical differences of their ages, but the experiential gaps that come from such disparate life stages. He approaches their bed with the confidence of a man who has known other women, who has learned about pleasure from slaves and prostitutes. She approaches with the innocence and perhaps fear of someone whose entire understanding of sexuality has been shaped by duty and obligation. The Roman bedroom itself was a space that reflected these complex dynamics. Unlike the elaborate sleeping chambers we might see in movies, most Roman bedrooms were relatively simple affairs. The marriage bed, often made of wood and rope, was covered with woolen blankets and perhaps a few cushions. The room might be decorated with frescoes depicting mythological scenes, but these were more about displaying wealth and culture than creating romantic ambiance. The space was functional rather than sensual, designed for rest and procreation rather than for the kind of intimate exploration that might build deep emotional bonds between partners. Within these chambers, Roman couples developed their own private rituals and accommodations. Some marriages, despite their arranged nature and the legal inequalities they embodied, did evolve into partnerships characterized by genuine affection and mutual respect. We find evidence of this in the personal letters that have survived from the period, in the tombstone inscriptions that speak of beloved spouses, and in the literary works that celebrate marital love alongside the more common themes of passionate affairs and unrequited longing. But for many Roman wives, marital intimacy remained a duty performed in silence. Roman culture valued feminine modesty and restraint, particularly in the bedroom. Women were expected to be passive participants in sexual encounters, to submit gracefully to their husband's desires without expressing their own needs or preferences. The ideal Roman wife was supposed to find her pleasure in her husband's satisfaction, her fulfillment in the children she bore him, rather than in the physical act itself. This expectation of silent submission had profound psychological effects on Roman women. Many learned to divorce their emotional selves from their physical experiences, to endure rather than to enjoy their most intimate moments. They developed coping mechanisms that allowed them to fulfill their marital duties while protecting their inner lives from the potential pain of unfulfilled desire or unrequited affection. Some found emotional outlets in their relationships with other women, in their devotion to their children, or in their participation in religious ceremonies that offered alternative forms of spiritual and emotional connection. The Romans did recognize that some level of physical pleasure was necessary for conception. They believed that a woman needed to experience some degree of arousal for pregnancy to occur, which led to medical advice about techniques for ensuring female satisfaction. But this concern for women's pleasure was primarily instrumental, focused on its role in reproduction rather than on its intrinsic value for the woman's well-being or happiness. Roman medical texts described various methods for enhancing female pleasure, but these recommendations were framed in terms of their benefits for conception rather than for the woman's own experience. Physicians advised husbands to be patient, to engage in what we might recognize as foreplay, and to pay attention to their wives' physical responses. But these suggestions were made in the context of producing healthy children, not of creating fulfilling intimate relationships. The emotional distance that characterized many Roman marriages extended into their most private moments. Elite Roman couples often lived largely separate lives, coming together primarily for formal social occasions and for the procreative encounters that were essential to maintaining family lines. They might share a house, but they often maintained separate social circles, pursued different interests, and developed independent relationships with friends and associates. This emotional separation was particularly pronounced in the highest levels of Roman society, where marriages were often political alliances that united powerful families. The bride and groom might have met only a few times before their wedding, and their subsequent relationship might remain formal and distant even after years of marriage. They learned to work together as partners in managing their household and raising their children, but they might never develop the kind of intimate emotional connection that would enhance their physical relationship. Yet within these constraints, some Roman couples found ways to create meaningful connections. They developed private jokes and shared interests, created rituals of affection that existed alongside their formal duties, and learned to read each other's subtle communications in ways that enhanced both their emotional and physical intimacy. These relationships required tremendous skill and patience as couples navigated the complex expectations of their society while trying to create some measure of personal happiness. Asterisk. The seasonal rhythms of Roman life also affected marital intimacy. Agricultural cycles, religious festivals, and social obligations all influenced when and how married couples came together. There were periods when sexual activity was considered inappropriate, times when couples were expected to abstain in preparation for religious ceremonies or in observance of mourning periods. These external rhythms created a framework within which couples had to find their own patterns of connection and intimacy. But Roman literature provides us with glimpses into how these constraints affected individual relationships. We read of wives who found ways to signal their desires and preferences to husbands who were willing to listen, of couples who developed their own private languages of touch and gesture that allowed them to communicate beyond the formal roles society assigned them. We also read of the loneliness and frustration that characterized marriages where such communication never developed. The physical environment of Roman homes also shaped marital intimacy. Most Roman houses were designed around the principle of the atrium, a central courtyard that was the heart of family life. Private bedrooms were often small and located near the busier areas of the house, which meant that couples had to be mindful of being overheard by children, slaves, and other family members. This lack of privacy created additional pressure for wives to remain silent during intimate encounters, reinforcing the expectation that their role was passive and uncomplaining. Roman attitudes toward pregnancy and childbirth further complicated marital intimacy. Pregnancy was seen as a dangerous time for both mother and child, leading to periods of abstinence that could last for months. Roman medical texts warned against sexual activity during certain stages of pregnancy, and many couples avoided intimate contact entirely once a pregnancy was confirmed. These interruptions to physical intimacy could create additional emotional distance between spouses, particularly if the wife suffered from the high rates of maternal mortality that characterized ancient childbirth. The Romans also maintained complex beliefs about the relationship between sexual activity and health. They believed that excessive sexual activity could weaken both men and women, leading to illness and premature death. This created pressure for couples to moderate their intimate encounters, to approach sexuality with restraint and discipline rather than with passion or abandon. The ideal Roman couple was supposed to come together regularly enough to produce children, but not so frequently as to endanger their health or their moral character. These health concerns were particularly pronounced for women, whom Romans believed were naturally weaker and more susceptible to the dangers of sexual excess. Roman medical texts warned that too much sexual activity could cause women to become hysterical or ill, leading to advice that wives should approach the marriage bed with calm resignation rather than with desire or enthusiasm. This medical framework provided additional justification for the expectation that women should be passive participants in their own intimate lives. The Roman legal system's approach to marital rape further illustrates the complex relationship between law, duty, and intimate connection. Roman law recognized no concept of marital rape. A husband's right to sexual access was absolute and unquestioned. This legal framework meant that wives had no recourse if their husbands were cruel, violent, or indifferent to their well-being. The law that was supposed to protect marriage actually created conditions where abuse was not only possible, but legally sanctioned. Asterisk. Yet within these harsh legal realities, some Roman couples found ways to create relationships characterized by mutual respect and genuine affection. We find evidence of husbands who treated their wives with kindness and consideration, who sought to understand their needs and preferences, and who worked to create intimate relationships that brought joy and satisfaction to both partners. These relationships required men who were willing to look beyond their legal rights to consider their wives' humanity, and women who were skilled enough to communicate their needs within the constraints of their expected roles. Asterisk. The Romans left us a complex legacy when it comes to understanding marital intimacy. Their legal and social systems created frameworks that seem oppressive to modern eyes. Yet within these constraints, real people found ways to love and be loved, to create meaningful connections, and to build relationships that sustained them through the challenges of life in the ancient world. Their experiences remind us that the human need for connection and understanding transcends the particular circumstances of any historical period. As we reflect on these Roman marriages, we see couples navigating between duty and desire, between social expectation and personal need, between the roles society assigned them and the individuals they actually were. Some found ways to bridge these gaps, to create intimate relationships that honored both their public obligations and their private longings. Others remained trapped in formal arrangements that provided social stability but little personal satisfaction. The Roman approach to marital intimacy reveals the complex ways that law, culture, and personal need intersect in the most private areas of human experience. It shows us how people can find ways to create meaning and connection even within systems that seem designed to prevent such relationships from flourishing. And it reminds us that the human heart, in all its complexity and resilience, has always found ways to express itself, even in the most challenging circumstances. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, imagine those Roman couples in their simple bedrooms, navigating the complex terrain of duty and desire, of law and love, of social expectation and personal need. Some found ways to create beautiful, lasting relationships within the constraints of their time. Others endured arrangements that provided stability but little joy. All of them remind us that the human experience of intimacy, in all its complexity and contradiction, remains remarkably constant across the centuries. Let these images settle gently in your mind. The young bride learning to find her voice within the constraints of her role. The older husband discovering that kindness brings more satisfaction than dominance. The couple who learned to communicate through glances and touches that spoke volumes in the silence their society demanded. These were real people, with real feelings, real hopes, and real fears, finding ways to love and be loved within the circumstances of their time. Chapter 3. Desire as Power. As we settle deeper into our quiet exploration of ancient Rome's most intimate spaces, we encounter a fundamental truth that shaped every touch, every glance, every whispered word between lovers. In Roman society, desire was never simply about attraction or affection. It was about power, control, and the careful maintenance of social hierarchies that extended from the public forum into the most private chambers. Tonight, let us gently examine how the Romans understood masculinity, dominance, and the complex ways that physical pleasure became entangled with social control. The Roman understanding of masculinity was built upon a foundation of dominance that permeated every aspect of intimate life. A true Roman man was expected to be the active participant in all his relationships, the one who took rather than received, who controlled rather than surrendered. This wasn't merely a preference or a cultural ideal. It was a fundamental organizing principle that determined how Roman men understood their own identities and their place in the world. The Latin language itself reflected this worldview, with words for sexual activity that emphasized the active and passive roles rather than mutual participation or shared pleasure. Picture, if you will, a Roman nobleman in his private chambers preparing for an evening of pleasure. His understanding of what was about to unfold was shaped not by modern concepts of romantic connection or mutual exploration, but by his role as the dominus, the master of his household and his own desires. Whether he was with his wife, a slave, or a professional courtesan, his approach to physical intimacy was filtered through this lens of control and dominance. He was expected to take what he wanted, when he wanted it, in the manner that pleased him most. Asterisk. This emphasis on dominance created a sexual culture where the physical act itself became a demonstration of social status and personal power. Roman men were judged not by their ability to give pleasure or create emotional connection, but by their capacity to assert control over their partners and their own desires. The buyer Roman lover was one who could maintain his composure, who could direct the encounter according to his will, and who could walk away afterward with his dignity and authority intact. Asterisk. The Romans made careful distinctions between acceptable and unacceptable partners for their male citizens, distinctions that reveal the complex relationship between desire and social status. A Roman man could seek pleasure with slaves, prostitutes, and actors without any loss of social standing, provided he maintained his dominant role. These relationships were seen as natural outlets for male desire, necessary for maintaining social order and personal health. The men who used these services were not judged harshly. Indeed, it was considered almost inevitable that they would do so. But the same Roman man who could freely enjoy the services of a slave or prostitute faced severe social consequences if he took a passive role in any relationship, or if he pursued connections with women of his own social class outside the bounds of marriage. The distinction wasn't based on the morality of the act itself, but on whether it reinforced or challenged the established hierarchies of Roman society. Pleasure was acceptable as long as it didn't threaten the social order. It became dangerous when it suggested that the natural hierarchies of dominance and submission might be questioned or reversed. The bodies of slaves occupied a particularly complex position in this system of desire and power. Roman law was clear that slaves had no right to refuse their masters' advances, no ability to control their own sexual experiences, and no legal recourse if they were mistreated. Yet within this brutal framework, some relationships developed that resembled affection or even love. Masters might show preference for particular slaves, might treat them with kindness or consideration, might even eventually free them and marry them. But these relationships always existed within the fundamental reality of ownership and control. Roman men learned to view the bodies of their slaves as extensions of their own power and authority. A slave's physical beauty, sexual availability, and capacity for pleasure all belonged to the master, to be used or withheld according to his desires. This created a culture where human bodies became commodities, where physical pleasure was divorced from emotional connection, and where the most intimate acts were expressions of dominance rather than affection. The Romans developed elaborate protocols for how these relationships should be conducted, rules that reinforced the power dynamics while providing some structure for potentially chaotic situations. Masters were expected to be discreet in their use of slaves, to avoid creating situations that might embarrass their wives or disrupt their households. They were advised to rotate their attentions among different slaves, rather than forming exclusive attachments that might threaten their authority or create jealousy among their property. Yet even within these constraints, the human heart found ways to complicate the simple equations of power and pleasure. Roman literature is filled with stories of masters who fell genuinely in love with their slaves, who found themselves emotionally dependent on people they legally owned. These relationships created profound contradictions. How could a man maintain his authority over someone he loved? How could he express genuine affection within a framework of absolute control? Some masters resolved these contradictions by freeing their beloved slaves, but this solution created new problems as freedmen and freed women occupied an ambiguous position in Roman society. The institution of prostitution provided another outlet for Roman male desire, one that was both more socially acceptable and more emotionally distant than relationships with household slaves. Roman cities contained numerous brothels, ranging from simple rooms near the docks to elaborate establishments that catered to wealthy clients. These spaces were designed to provide physical pleasure without emotional complication, to allow men to satisfy their desires without threatening their social positions or domestic arrangements. Roman prostitutes came from various backgrounds, but they shared the common characteristic of being outside the normal social hierarchy. They might be slaves owned by brothel keepers, freed women trying to support themselves, or foreign women who had few other options for survival. Their marginalized status made them safe partners for Roman men who could enjoy their services without fear of social consequences or emotional entanglements. The physical spaces where these encounters took place were designed to reinforce the transactional nature of the relationships. Brothels were typically small, functional rooms furnished with little more than a bed and basic washing facilities. The walls might be decorated with erotic art, but this was intended to stimulate desire rather than create romantic ambiance. The environment emphasized the physical act itself, divorced from the emotional and social connections that might complicate the simple exchange of money for pleasure. Roman men approached these encounters with the same emphasis on dominance and control that characterized their other relationships. They expected to direct the experience, to receive the services they desired, and to maintain their authority throughout the encounter. The professional nature of the relationship actually reinforced this dynamic, as the women involved were paid to be accommodating and submissive, to fulfill their clients' desires without expressing their own needs or preferences. The Romans also developed complex attitudes toward male-male relationships that reflected their broader understanding of power and dominance. These relationships were acceptable and even celebrated, provided they maintained the proper hierarchies of age and social status. An older Roman man might take a younger male lover without social condemnation, as long as he maintained the active dominant role. The younger partner, typically a slave or someone of lower social status, was expected to be passive and submissive. These relationships were often seen as educational as well as pleasurable, with older men serving as mentors and guides for their younger partners. The physical intimacy was understood as one aspect of a broader relationship that might include instruction in literature, philosophy, and social skills. But even these mentoring relationships were structured around principles of dominance and submission, with the older partner maintaining authority over both the sexual and educational aspects of the connection. The Roman emphasis on control extended to their understanding of pleasure itself. Physical satisfaction was seen as something to be managed and directed, not something to be surrendered to or lost in. Roman men were advised to maintain their composure during intimate encounters, to remain in control of their responses, and to avoid the kind of passionate abandonment that might compromise their dignity or authority. The ideal Roman lover was one who could give and receive pleasure while maintaining his rational faculties and social position. This approach to pleasure had profound implications for how Roman men understood their own desires and emotions. They learned to compartmentalize their physical needs, to separate sexual satisfaction from emotional connection, and to view their own bodies as instruments of control rather than sources of vulnerability. The Romans developed elaborate theories about how different types of pleasure affected the mind and spirit, with most concluding that the wise man should enjoy physical satisfaction while remaining emotionally detached from the experience. The bodies of Roman men themselves became sites of power and control, carefully maintained and displayed to reinforce their social status. Roman culture celebrated the masculine physique, but in specific ways that emphasized strength, control, and dominance. Men were expected to keep their bodies fit and attractive, but not in ways that might suggest vanity or excessive concern with appearance. The ideal Roman male body was one that projected authority and capability, that could give pleasure while maintaining its own dignity and power. Roman bathing culture provided a space where these attitudes toward the body and pleasure could be expressed and reinforced. The public baths were places where men could display their physiques, engage in physical activities that demonstrated their strength and skill, and participate in social rituals that reinforced their status and authority. But even these spaces were carefully regulated, with rules about behavior and interaction that maintained the hierarchies of Roman society. The Romans understood that uncontrolled desire could be dangerous, that it could lead men to make poor decisions or to compromise their social positions. They developed elaborate strategies for managing sexual desire, including dietary recommendations, exercise regimens, and philosophical practices designed to maintain rational control over physical impulses. The goal was not to eliminate desire, but to harness it in ways that served the individual's broader social and political objectives. This emphasis on control created a culture where spontaneity and emotional vulnerability were seen as weaknesses rather than virtues. Roman men learned to approach their most intimate moments with the same strategic thinking they applied to business or political decisions. They calculated the potential benefits and risks of different relationships, planned their encounters to maximize pleasure while minimizing social consequences, and maintained emotional distance even in their most physically intimate moments. The Romans also developed complex theories about the relationship between sexual activity and other forms of power. They believed that sexual energy could be channeled into political and military achievements, that the man who could control his desires could also control his enemies and his environment. This created pressure for Roman men to view their sexual lives as training grounds for other forms of dominance and control. These attitudes toward desire and power had profound effects on Roman women, who found themselves navigating a world where their bodies were understood primarily as objects of male control and pleasure. Women of different social classes faced different challenges, but all had to find ways to survive and sometimes thrive within systems that gave them little agency over their own physical experiences. The Romans left us a complex legacy when it comes to understanding the relationship between desire and power. Their approach to sexuality was both more open and more constrained than our own, celebrating physical pleasure while embedding it within rigid hierarchies of control and dominance. They created systems that allowed some people to explore their desires freely while denying others the most basic rights of consent and autonomy. As we reflect on these Roman attitudes toward desire and power, we see a society that understood the profound connections between physical intimacy and social control. They recognized that sexuality was never simply a private matter, that it always reflected and reinforced broader patterns of dominance and submission. Their experiences remind us that the ways we understand and express desire are always shaped by the power structures of our particular historical moment. The Roman emphasis on control and dominance created both opportunities and limitations for human connection. Some found ways to experience genuine pleasure and satisfaction within these constraints, developing relationships that honored both their social obligations and their personal desires. Others remained trapped in systems that denied them agency over their own bodies and emotions, forced to navigate between survival and dignity in circumstances that offered few good choices. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, imagine those Roman men and women navigating the complex terrain of desire and power, of physical pleasure and social control. Some found ways to create meaningful connections within the constraints of their time, developing relationships that brought satisfaction despite the limitations of their social system. Others remained trapped in patterns of dominance and submission that denied them the possibility of genuine intimacy or emotional connection. Let these images settle gently in your mind. The Roman master learning that true pleasure might require something more than simple dominance, the slave finding ways to maintain dignity within impossible circumstances, the couple discovering that power shared might be more satisfying than power hoarded. These were real people with real desires, real fears, and real hopes, finding ways to express their humanity within the circumstances of their time. The Roman understanding of desire as power reveals the complex ways that sexuality intersects with broader social and political structures. It shows us how systems of domination can shape the most intimate aspects of human experience, and how people can find ways to resist or transform these systems even within their most personal relationships. Their experiences remind us that the human need for connection and understanding transcends the particular power structures of any historical period, and that the heart's deepest desires often find ways to express themselves despite the constraints of law, custom, and social expectation. Chapter 4. Same-sex relationships *, as we continue our gentle journey through the intimate landscapes of ancient Rome, we now turn to explore one of the most complex and nuanced aspects of Roman sexual culture, the relationships that existed between people of the same gender. These connections, far from being hidden or forbidden, were woven into the fabric of Roman society in ways that might surprise us today, yet they were governed by the same principles of power, status, and social hierarchy that shaped all Roman relationships, creating a world where love between men or between women could be celebrated, tolerated, or condemned depending on the circumstances and the roles each person played. The Romans approached same-sex relationships with the same practical mindset they brought to all aspects of human sexuality. They were less concerned with the gender of the participants than with the roles they assumed, the power dynamics they created, and the ways these relationships either reinforced or challenged the established social order. A Roman man's masculinity was not threatened by his desire for another man, provided he maintained his position as the dominant partner and chose his companions from appropriate social classes. Picture, if you will, a Roman gymnasium in the late afternoon where young men exercise under the watchful eyes of their elders. The space is filled with the sounds of athletic training, the scrape of strigils against oiled skin, and the quiet conversations between mentors and students. Here, relationships between older and younger men were not only accepted, but actively encouraged, seen as essential to the education and development of young Roman citizens. The older men, established in their careers and social positions, served as guides and protectors for their younger companions, offering instruction in everything from military tactics to poetic composition. These mentoring relationships often included physical intimacy, but this was understood as one aspect of a broader educational experience. The Romans believed that the deep affection that could develop between an older man and his protege enhanced the learning process, creating bonds of loyalty and understanding that would serve both partners throughout their lives. The physical aspects of these relationships were governed by strict protocols that maintained the proper hierarchies of age and experience. The older partner, typically in his 30s or 40s, was expected to be the active participant in all aspects of the relationship. He was the teacher, the protector, the one who gave guidance and support. His younger companion, often in his teens or early 20s, was expected to be receptive, grateful, and eager to learn. This dynamic mirrored the broader patterns of Roman society, where authority flowed from age and experience toward youth and inexperience. Roman literature from this period is filled with poetry celebrating these relationships, verses that capture the complex emotions of mentorship, friendship, and physical desire. The poets wrote of the beauty of young men with the same appreciation they showed for feminine beauty, describing smooth skin, graceful movements, and the particular charm of youth approaching maturity. These were not hidden or shameful desires, but celebrated aspects of Roman aesthetic and emotional life. The military provided another context where same-sex relationships flourished within acceptable social frameworks. Roman soldiers often formed deep bonds with their comrades, relationships that combined friendship, loyalty, and sometimes physical intimacy. These connections were seen as strengthening military units, creating bonds of trust and mutual support that could make the difference between victory and defeat in battle. Imagine, if you will, a Roman military camp on the frontier, where men far from home sought comfort and companionship with their fellow soldiers. The harsh conditions of military life, the constant threat of death, and the isolation from their families created circumstances where emotional and physical intimacy between men was not only tolerated, but often encouraged by commanders who understood its value for morale and unit cohesion. These military relationships were governed by the same principles of hierarchy and dominance that characterized civilian same-sex relationships. Higher-ranking soldiers might form attachments with their subordinates, but these connections were expected to reinforce rather than challenge the chain of command. The physical intimacy was understood as one expression of the loyalty and trust that bound military units together. Asterisk, the Romans also recognized and celebrated same-sex relationships among their poets, artists, and intellectuals. The creative communities of Rome were spaces where conventional social hierarchies were somewhat relaxed, where talent and artistic achievement could transcend the usual considerations of birth and wealth. In these circles, relationships between men of similar age and social status were more common and more openly acknowledged. Asterisk, Roman poetry from this period includes some of the most beautiful love lyrics ever written, verses that capture the full range of human emotion, from passionate desire to deep spiritual connection. The poets wrote of their male lovers with the same intensity and devotion they showed for their female partners, creating works that celebrate the universality of human affection and desire. Yet even in these relatively accepting environments, the relationships were still shaped by considerations of power and social status. A successful poet might mentor a younger artist, providing guidance and support in exchange for companionship and affection. A wealthy patron might support a talented writer or musician, creating relationships that combined artistic collaboration with personal intimacy. The Romans developed sophisticated vocabularies for describing different types of same-sex relationships, distinctions that reveal the complexity of their understanding. They had words for the older partner in a mentoring relationship, for the younger companion who was learning and growing, and for the various types of affection and desire that could exist between men. These linguistic distinctions helped them navigate the social complexities of relationships that were accepted in some contexts but problematic in others. Roman attitudes towards same-sex relationships were also influenced by their understanding of Greek culture, which they simultaneously admired and viewed with suspicion. The Greeks had their own traditions of same-sex relationships, particularly between older men and younger boys, that the Romans found both appealing and potentially dangerous. They adopted some Greek practices while adapting them to fit their own social structures and values. The Romans were particularly concerned with maintaining the proper age differentials in same-sex relationships. A relationship between an older man and a much younger partner was seen as natural and beneficial, providing the younger person with guidance and protection while giving the older partner the pleasure of youth and beauty. But relationships between men of similar age were more problematic, as they challenged the hierarchical structures that Romans believed were essential to social order. This emphasis on age and hierarchy created particular challenges for men who found themselves attracted to partners of their own age and social status. Such relationships could exist, but they required careful navigation of social expectations and potential criticism. The partners had to find ways to maintain their individual dignity and social standing while expressing their affection and desire for each other. The physical spaces where these relationships unfolded were carefully chosen to maintain discretion while allowing for intimacy. Private homes, bathhouses, and secluded areas of public buildings provided settings where men could meet and express their affections without attracting unwanted attention. The Romans understood that even acceptable relationships needed to be conducted with appropriate discretion. Roman bath culture provided particularly important spaces for same-sex relationships to develop and flourish. The public baths were places where men of different ages and social classes could meet in relaxed, informal settings. The ritual of bathing, with its emphasis on physical care and cleanliness, created natural opportunities for intimate conversation and gentle physical contact. The architecture of Roman baths was designed to facilitate these interactions, with warm pools where men could relax together, exercise areas where they could demonstrate their physical prowess, and quiet alcoves where private conversations could take place. The combination of nakedness, warm water, and social interaction created an atmosphere where emotional and physical intimacy could develop naturally. Roman slaves occupied a particularly complex position in the world of same-sex relationships. Like their female counterparts, male slaves had no legal right to refuse their master's advances, and they were often specifically chosen for their physical beauty and sexual availability. Yet within this brutal framework, some relationships developed genuine affection and mutual care. The Romans recognized that the most beautiful and intelligent slaves could command particular attention and preferential treatment. A master who became genuinely attached to a male slave might grant him special privileges, better living conditions, and eventually even freedom. These relationships could evolve from simple physical attraction into complex emotional bonds that lasted for years or even decades. The practice of manumission, or freeing slaves, was sometimes motivated by these personal attachments. A Roman man who had formed a deep bond with a male slave might grant him freedom as a gesture of affection or gratitude. The former slave would then become a freedman with limited rights and social status, but much greater autonomy than he had enjoyed as property. These relationships between masters and slaves reveal the complex ways that power and affection could intersect in Roman society. The master retained ultimate authority, but he might choose to exercise it with kindness and consideration. The slave remained vulnerable and dependent, but he might find ways to influence his master's decisions and improve his circumstances through charm, intelligence, and emotional connection. Roman attitudes towards same-sex relationships were also shaped by their understanding of divine love and spiritual connection. They recognized that the deepest human relationships could transcend physical desire to become expressions of spiritual affinity and mutual understanding. Some same-sex relationships were celebrated not just for their physical beauty, but for the intellectual and emotional bonds they created. The Romans were familiar with stories from Greek mythology about same-sex relationships among the gods, tales that provided models for human behavior and understanding. These stories suggested that same-sex desire was not only natural, but potentially sacred, a reflection of divine patterns of love and connection that humans could aspire to emulate. Yet the Romans also maintained strict boundaries around what types of same-sex relationships were acceptable and what types were condemned. A Roman man who took the passive role in a relationship with another man faced severe social consequences, regardless of his partner's identity or social status. The distinction between active and passive roles was fundamental to Roman understanding of masculinity and social order. This emphasis on sexual roles created particular challenges for men who preferred to be passive partners or who wanted to explore different types of physical intimacy. Such desires were seen as threats to masculine identity and social stability, leading to social ostracism and legal penalties for those who were discovered in such relationships. The Romans developed elaborate strategies for maintaining acceptable same-sex relationships while avoiding the social dangers that could arise from inappropriate role reversals or age disparities. These strategies included careful attention to timing, location, and discretion, as well as the cultivation of relationships that could be publicly acknowledged and defended. Female same-sex relationships in Roman society were much less visible and well documented than their male counterparts, but they certainly existed and sometimes flourished within the constraints of Roman social structures. The relative invisibility of these relationships in Roman literature and legal documents reflects the broader marginalization of women's experiences and desires in Roman society. Roman women faced different challenges and opportunities when it came to same-sex relationships. Their social roles were more restricted than those of men, but they also had access to different types of spaces and relationships that could provide context for intimate connections with other women. The women's quarters of Roman homes, religious ceremonies, and social gatherings provided settings where women could form deep emotional bonds. The Romans recognized that women could form intense friendships that included physical affection and emotional intimacy, but they were less likely to document or celebrate these relationships in the same way they did male partnerships. This invisibility doesn't mean that such relationships were less important or meaningful to the women involved, but rather that they existed in spaces that were less visible to the male writers and historians who created most of our surviving sources. Roman religious life provided some contexts where female same-sex relationships could develop and flourish. The worship of certain goddesses, particularly those associated with female power and sexuality, created spaces where women could express their affections and desires with less social constraint. Religious festivals and ceremonies provided opportunities for women to gather together and form bonds that might not have been possible in other contexts. The Romans also recognized the existence of women who preferred to take more active, masculine roles in their relationships with other women. These women, though rare and often criticized, were acknowledged as part of the spectrum of human diversity. They faced social challenges and legal restrictions, but they also found ways to express their identities and desires within the constraints of their society. Roman literature includes scattered references to female same-sex relationships, usually in the context of criticism or moral condemnation, but these references suggest that such relationships were known and recognized, even if they were not celebrated. The fact that writers felt the need to condemn such relationships indicates that they were common enough to be considered a social issue. The Romans understood that the boundaries between friendship and romantic love could be fluid, particularly in relationships between women. They recognized that deep emotional bonds could develop between women who shared living spaces, participated in religious activities together, or supported each other through the challenges of Roman life. The institution of marriage created particular challenges for women who were attracted to other women, unlike men who could maintain same-sex relationships alongside their marriages. Women were expected to focus their emotional and physical energy on their husbands and children. This created pressures and conflicts that could be difficult to resolve. Yet some Roman women found ways to maintain meaningful relationships with other women even within the constraints of marriage and motherhood. These relationships might exist as deep friendships that included physical affection, as mentor-student relationships that provided emotional support and guidance, or as religious partnerships that created spiritual bonds transcending ordinary social boundaries. The Romans left us a complex legacy regarding same-sex relationships, one that reveals both the possibilities and limitations of ancient attitudes toward human sexuality and affection. Their acceptance of certain types of same-sex relationships was broader than what would characterize many later periods, but it was also constrained by rigid hierarchies and social expectations that limited the full expression of human diversity. As we reflect on these Roman same-sex relationships, we see people finding ways to love and be loved within the constraints of their time, creating connections that brought meaning and joy to their lives, while navigating the complex social expectations of their society. Some found ways to build lasting partnerships that honored both their personal desires and their social obligations. Others remained trapped in circumstances that forced them to hide or suppress their deepest feelings. The Roman understanding of same-sex relationships reveals the complex ways that culture, law, and personal desire intersect to create the possibilities and limitations of human connection. Their experiences remind us that the ways we understand and express love and desire are always shaped by the particular circumstances of our historical moment, and that people in every age have found ways to create meaningful relationships despite the constraints they face. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, imagine those Roman men and women navigating the complex terrain of same-sex desire and affection, finding ways to love and be loved within the possibilities and limitations of their time. Some discovered relationships that brought them deep satisfaction and lasting happiness. Others had to content themselves with briefer connections or unfulfilled longings. All of them remind us that the human heart, in all its complexity and variety, has always found ways to express itself despite the constraints of law, custom, and social expectation. Let these images settle gently in your mind. The older Roman mentor discovering unexpected depth in his affection for a younger student, the soldier finding comfort and companionship with a fellow warrior, the poet creating beautiful verses inspired by love for another man, the Roman women finding ways to express their deepest feelings within the constraints of their society. These were real people, with real desires, real hopes, and real fears, creating connections that transcended the boundaries their world tried to impose. The Roman experience of same-sex relationships shows us how human love and desire can flourish even within systems that seek to control and limit them. It reminds us that the capacity for connection and affection transcends the particular social structures of any historical period, and that people in every age have found ways to create meaningful relationships that honor both their personal needs and their social obligations. Chapter 5: Slavery, Consent, and Control. As we continue our gentle journey through the intimate world of ancient Rome, we must now turn our attention to a darker chapter of this complex civilization. The soft glow of oil lamps flickers across marble walls as we explore the harsh realities that existed beneath the surface of Roman society. Tonight, we examine the lives of those who had no voice, no choice, and no freedom in matters of the most personal nature. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the streets of Rome lay empty save for the occasional patrol, enslaved people throughout the city began their daily existence without the fundamental right that we consider essential today. The concept of consent, as we understand it, simply did not exist for those bound in slavery. They were considered property, objects to be owned, traded, and used according to their master's will. This was not a hidden reality, but an accepted foundation of Roman society, woven into the very fabric of daily life like threads in a tapestry. The legal framework of Rome was crystal clear in its treatment of enslaved individuals. They possessed no legal personhood, no ability to make decisions about their own bodies, and no recourse when subjected to unwanted advances or demands. The law viewed them as extensions of their owner's household, much like livestock or furniture. This dehumanizing system created an environment where sexual exploitation was not merely possible, but expected and normalized. The soft whisper of sandals on stone floors often marked the approach of those who held absolute power over the vulnerable. Within the grand domus of wealthy Romans, with their marble columns and painted walls depicting scenes of mythology and nature, enslaved people moved through their daily routines, knowing that their bodies were not their own. Household slaves, those who served in the private quarters of their masters, faced particular vulnerabilities. They were constantly present, available at any hour, and completely dependent on the whims of those who owned them. The proximity of their quarters to the family's private spaces meant that they were perpetually accessible, with no locked doors or private spaces to retreat to. The sexual expectations placed upon household slaves were rarely spoken of directly, but were understood by all. Young slaves, particularly those considered attractive by Roman standards, found themselves in especially precarious positions. Their value was often determined not just by their ability to perform domestic tasks, but by their physical appearance and the pleasure they could provide. This was true for both male and female slaves, as Roman sexuality did not discriminate based on gender when it came to the exploitation of the powerless. In the quiet corridors of Roman homes, where frescoes depicted pastoral scenes and the scent of incense drifted through the air, enslaved people navigated a world where refusal was not an option. They learned to read the subtle signs of their master's moods, to anticipate desires before they were voiced, and to submit without protest. The psychological toll of this existence was immense, yet it was a burden carried in silence. There were no support systems, no legal protections, and no hope of justice for those who suffered abuse. The training of young slaves often included explicit instruction in sexual techniques and practices. This education was not for their benefit, but to increase their value and usefulness to their owners. Children born into slavery grew up understanding that their bodies would be used for the pleasure of others, and they were prepared for this reality from an early age. The innocence of childhood was a luxury that enslaved children could not afford, as they were groomed for a life of servitude that encompassed every aspect of their existence. Roman literature and art from this period occasionally reference the sexual use of slaves, but these mentions are often casual and matter-of-fact, reflecting the normalized nature of such practices. Poets might write about the beauty of a slave in their household, treating them as objects of aesthetic appreciation rather than human beings with their own feelings and desires. The dehumanization was so complete that the suffering of enslaved people was rarely acknowledged or considered worthy of comment. The emotional and psychological impact on enslaved individuals was profound and lasting. Many developed complex coping mechanisms to survive in an environment where their personhood was denied. Some withdrew into themselves, creating inner worlds where they could maintain a sense of self despite their circumstances. Others learned to manipulate the system as best they could, using whatever small advantages they possessed to improve their situation or protect themselves from the worst abuses. Female slaves faced additional challenges related to reproduction and childbearing. Their fertility was considered another asset to be exploited, and they had no say in whether they became pregnant or gave birth. Children born from these unions often remained enslaved, perpetuating the cycle of exploitation across generations. The maternal bond between enslaved women and their children was recognized but not respected, as families could be separated at any time according to their owners' wishes or financial needs. The brothels of Rome, known as lupanaria, represented perhaps the most systematized form of sexual exploitation in the ancient world. These establishments, scattered throughout the city's neighborhoods, housed hundreds of enslaved people who were forced into prostitution. The narrow stone corridors and small chambers of these buildings bore witness to countless acts of coercion and abuse. The walls, decorated with explicit artwork advertising the services available, created an atmosphere where human beings were reduced to mere commodities in a marketplace of flesh. The individuals trapped within these brothels came from various backgrounds and circumstances. Some were captured in military campaigns and sold into this particular form of slavery. Others were born into slavery and assigned to brothels by their owners. Still others were free people who had fallen into debt or been convicted of crimes, finding themselves stripped of their freedom and forced into prostitution as punishment. Regardless of their origin, all shared the common experience of having their autonomy completely removed. The daily existence within a Roman brothel was marked by degradation and dehumanization. Enslaved people were given numbers or crude nicknames rather than being addressed by their proper names. They were examined like livestock, with potential customers inspecting their bodies before making selections. The small cubicles where they were forced to work were cramped and uncomfortable, offering no privacy or dignity. The constant stream of clients meant that there was no respite, no time to heal physically or emotionally from the trauma of their circumstances. The economic structure of these establishments was designed to maximize profit while minimizing any consideration for the well-being of those forced to work within them. The owners, known as lenins, were typically freedmen or citizens who had invested in this lucrative business. They provided minimal food and shelter while extracting maximum value from their human property. The enslaved people themselves saw none of the profits generated by their exploitation, receiving only the bare necessities needed to keep them alive and functional. The clientele of these brothels represented a cross-section of Roman society. Wealthy patricians might visit alongside plebeians, soldiers, and slaves who had been given permission by their masters. The normalization of this industry meant that its use carried little social stigma for men, regardless of their social status. This acceptance perpetuated the system and ensured a steady stream of customers who saw nothing wrong with purchasing access to bodies that could not consent to their presence. The physical toll on those forced into prostitution was severe and often visible. Malnutrition, disease, and injury were common, as medical care was minimal and primarily focused on maintaining the ability to work rather than promoting genuine health. Many developed chronic conditions that would plague them for the remainder of their lives. The psychological trauma was equally devastating, though less visible to those who exploited them. The trafficked individuals who ended up in Roman brothels often had complex stories of displacement and loss. Some had been torn from their families and communities in distant lands, transported across vast distances to serve in these establishments. Others had been born in Rome, but sold into this life by desperate parents or cruel masters. The diversity of their backgrounds meant that they often could not communicate with one another, adding isolation to their already overwhelming burden of suffering. The legal system of Rome provided no protection for those trapped in prostitution. They could not file complaints against abusive customers, seek redress for injuries, or attempt to escape their circumstances through legal means. The law viewed their situation as a natural consequence of their enslaved status, offering no recognition of their humanity or suffering. This legal abandonment meant that any cruelty or abuse they experienced was essentially sanctioned by the state. The rare instances of manumission or freedom for those enslaved in brothels were typically granted only when individuals had become too old, sick, or damaged to continue generating profit. Even then, freedom often came with conditions that kept former slaves dependent on their previous owners. The trauma of their experiences frequently made it difficult for them to integrate into free society, and many struggled with the psychological aftermath of their enslavement for the rest of their lives. The contrast between the public face of Roman sexuality and the hidden reality of exploitation was stark and disturbing. While poets celebrated love and passion in their verses, and philosophers debated the nature of desire and attraction, countless individuals suffered in silence within a system that denied their basic humanity. The marble statues that adorned public spaces depicted idealized forms of beauty and sensuality, while real people were reduced to objects for the gratification of others. The cultural mythology surrounding Roman sexuality often emphasizes freedom and pleasure, but this freedom was available only to those with power and privilege. The sexual liberation celebrated in some historical accounts was built upon the systematic oppression and exploitation of the powerless. The gods and goddesses of love and fertility that Romans worshipped stood in tragic contrast to the reality experienced by those who had no choice in matters of intimacy and desire. The economic importance of sexual slavery to Roman society cannot be understated. The profits generated by brothels and the sexual exploitation of household slaves contributed significantly to the wealth of individual owners and the broader economy. This financial incentive created a powerful motivation to maintain and expand the system of sexual exploitation, ensuring that reform or abolition would face substantial resistance from those who benefited from these practices. As we reflect on these difficult truths about ancient Rome, we must acknowledge the immense human cost of a system that treated people as property. The voices of those who suffered under this system have been largely lost to history, their stories untold and their pain unrecorded. Yet their experiences were real, their suffering was profound, and their humanity was as valid as that of their oppressors, despite the denial of recognition they faced. The legacy of these practices extended far beyond the borders of Rome in the centuries of its existence. The normalization of sexual exploitation and the dehumanization of enslaved people created precedents that would influence legal systems, social structures, and cultural attitudes for generations to come. Understanding this history is essential for recognizing how systems of oppression operate and for ensuring that such systematic dehumanization never again becomes accepted or normalized. In the quiet moments before sleep, as we consider the weight of this history, we might pause to remember those whose names we will never know, whose stories were never recorded, and whose suffering was never acknowledged. Their lives mattered, their pain was real, and their humanity deserved recognition and respect. The gentle rhythm of our breathing connects us across the centuries to their struggles, reminding us of our shared humanity and our responsibility to create a more just and compassionate world. The complex intersection of power, sexuality, and human dignity in ancient Rome serves as a sobering reminder of how easily societies can normalize the exploitation of the vulnerable. The systems that enabled such widespread abuse were not accidents of history, but deliberate choices made by those in power to maximize their own pleasure and profit at the expense of others' well-being and freedom. Understanding these choices and their consequences helps us recognize similar patterns in our own time and work to prevent their repetition. As the oil lamps of ancient Rome dimmed and the city settled into the quiet hours of night, countless enslaved people lay in their simple quarters, their bodies exhausted from the demands placed upon them, their spirits struggling to maintain some sense of self in the face of systematic dehumanization. Their stories, though largely unrecorded, form an essential part of the historical record that we must not forget or ignore. In honoring their memory and acknowledging their suffering, we affirm the fundamental dignity and worth of every human being, regardless of their circumstances or the power structures that sought to define them. The gentle whisper of wind through the streets of ancient Rome carries with it the echoes of these forgotten voices, reminding us that history is not merely a collection of dates and events, but a tapestry woven from the lives and experiences of countless individuals. Some of these lives were marked by privilege and power, while others were defined by suffering and exploitation. All deserve our attention, our understanding, and our compassion as we seek to learn from the past and build a more just future for all. Chapter 6. The World of Brothels. As the gentle evening breeze carries the scent of olive oil and incense through the narrow streets of ancient Rome, we find ourselves drawn into the shadowy world of the Lupinaria, the brothels that dotted the urban landscape like scattered points of light in the darkness. These establishments, far from being hidden or forbidden, were woven into the very fabric of Roman society, as accepted and regulated as any other commercial enterprise. The soft shuffle of sandaled feet on worn stone pathways leads us through districts where pleasure was bought and sold with the same casual efficiency as bread or wine. The Roman approach to prostitution was pragmatic and systematic, reflecting their broader philosophy of governance and social organization. Rather than condemning or outlawing these practices, the state chose to regulate, tax, and control them. This legalization created a complex ecosystem of commerce, law, and human interaction that would persist for centuries. The gentle clink of coins changing hands echoed through narrow alleyways, where business was conducted with the same methodical precision that characterized Roman engineering and administration. The legal framework surrounding prostitution in ancient Rome was surprisingly sophisticated and detailed. Prostitutes were required to register with local authorities, much like merchants or craftsmen registering their trades. They were assigned specific districts where they could operate, particular days when they could conduct business, and even prescribed clothing that would identify their profession to potential customers. The soft rustle of the toga praetexta, the distinctive garment that marked their profession, became a familiar sound in certain neighborhoods of the city. The taxation of prostitution provided significant revenue for the Roman state, with records indicating that these levies were collected with the same diligence applied to other forms of commerce. Tax collectors, known as publicani, would make their rounds through the brothel districts, recording earnings and collecting their due portions. The steady scratch of stylus on wax tablet documented transactions that were considered as legitimate and necessary as any other form of trade. This systematic approach to taxation revealed the extent to which prostitution was integrated into the broader economic structure of Roman society. The physical locations of Roman brothels varied considerably depending on their clientele and the wealth of their operators. The most basic establishments, serving soldiers and laborers, were simple structures with small cubicles barely large enough for a narrow bed and a single occupant. These rooms, called cellae, were arranged along narrow corridors that echoed with the soft murmur of negotiation and the quiet creaking of wooden doors. The walls were typically constructed of rough stone or brick, with minimal decoration beyond the occasional obscene fresco or carved phallus that served both as advertisement and protection against the evil eye. The more elaborate brothels, catering to wealthy patricians and successful merchants, featured larger rooms with improved furnishings and decorative elements. These establishments might include small courtyards with fountains where the gentle splash of water provided a soothing backdrop to the evening's activities. The walls were often decorated with intricate frescoes depicting mythological scenes or erotic imagery, painted in the warm earth tones that characterized Roman art. Soft wool tapestries might hang from the walls, providing both decoration and sound dampening in the intimate spaces. The sensory experience of entering a Roman brothel was complex and overwhelming. The air was thick with the mingled scents of perfumed oils, burning incense, and the less pleasant odors of human bodies in close quarters. The sweet fragrance of rose petals and lavender, scattered on floors and beds, fought against the mustiness of poorly ventilated spaces and the lingering smell of olive oil used for both lamp fuel and personal lubrication. The gentle hiss of oil lamps provided flickering light that danced across painted walls, creating an atmosphere of intimate shadows and warm illumination. The soundscape of these establishments was equally distinctive. The soft murmur of conversation mixed with the occasional laugh or cry of pleasure, while the gentle plucking of lyres and the whispered melodies of flutes provided musical accompaniment to the evening's activities. The steady rhythm of feet on stone floors, the rustle of fabric, and the quiet closing of doors created a symphony of human activity that continued from dusk until dawn. In the background, the distant sounds of the city continued their eternal rhythm, reminding all within that this world existed as part of the larger tapestry of Roman life. The economic structure of Roman brothels was carefully organized and highly profitable. Price lists, carved into stone tablets or painted on wooden boards, displayed the costs of various services with the same matter-of-fact precision used for any other commercial transaction. These rates were typically standardized across different establishments, with variations based on the perceived attractiveness or skill of individual workers, the luxury of the accommodations, and the specific services requested. The gentle chime of coins counted and recounted provided a constant reminder of the commercial nature of these interactions. The use of tokens in place of direct payment was a common practice that added another layer of organization to these transactions. These small bronze or lead discs, known as tesserae, were often decorated with explicit imagery that indicated the specific service being purchased. Customers could acquire these tokens in advance, allowing for more discreet transactions and enabling the brothel owners to better track their earnings and inventory. The soft clink of these metal pieces created a unique sound that was immediately recognizable to those familiar with the trade. The walls of Roman brothels served as canvases for a unique form of ancient graffiti that provides modern historians with invaluable insights into the daily operations of these establishments. Customers would carve or paint messages onto the stone surfaces, recording their experiences, making recommendations, or simply asserting their presence in these spaces. These inscriptions, preserved for centuries in the volcanic ash of Pompeii and other sites, reveal the names of popular workers, the prices of services, and the crude humor that characterize these interactions. The graffiti also reveals the complex social dynamics that existed within these establishments. Some messages praise particular individuals for their skills or beauty, while others complain about prices or quality of service. The gentle scrape of iron stylus against stone walls created a permanent record of fleeting encounters, transforming these spaces into archives of human desire and commerce. Poetry and crude drawings intermingled with practical information, creating a rich tapestry of ancient urban life that speaks across the centuries. The individuals who worked within these establishments came from diverse backgrounds and circumstances, each bringing their own strategies for survival and success. Some were enslaved people with no choice in their circumstances, while others were free individuals who had chosen this profession for economic reasons. The soft whisper of shared secrets and survival strategies passed between workers created invisible networks of support and protection within an often harsh and exploitative environment. The performance aspect of work in Roman brothels was significant and multifaceted. Workers were expected to not only provide physical services, but also to create an atmosphere of pleasure and fantasy for their clients. This might involve adopting particular personas, engaging in elaborate roleplay, or demonstrating skills in music, dance, or conversation. The gentle rustle of silk costumes and the soft chime of jewelry created an atmosphere of theatrical sensuality that transformed commercial transactions into something approaching performance art. The daily routines within these establishments followed predictable patterns that provided structure and efficiency to the business operations. The morning hours were typically reserved for cleaning and preparation, with workers bathing, applying cosmetics, and arranging their personal spaces. The soft splash of water from ceramic basins and the gentle brushing of hair with ivory combs created a peaceful interlude before the evening's activities began. Meals were often communal affairs, providing opportunities for conversation and mutual support among those who shared these challenging circumstances. The management of Roman brothels required considerable skill and organization. The owners, known as lenos, were typically freedmen or citizens who had invested in this lucrative business. They were responsible for maintaining the physical facilities, managing the workforce, handling customer relations, and ensuring compliance with local regulations. The soft scratch of reed pens on papyrus documented the complex financial records that tracked earnings, expenses, and tax obligations with meticulous precision. The relationship between brothel workers and their clients was governed by unwritten rules and expectations that had evolved over generations. Regular customers might develop preferences for particular individuals, leading to relationships that, while still fundamentally commercial, took on aspects of familiarity and even affection. The gentle murmur of conversation between familiar partners created pockets of intimacy within the broader commercial environment, suggesting that human connection could flourish even in the most transactional of circumstances. The religious and spiritual aspects of Roman prostitution were complex and sometimes contradictory. While certain deities, particularly Venus and Priapus, were associated with sexuality and fertility, the actual practice of prostitution existed in a morally ambiguous space within Roman religious thought. Some brothels maintained small shrines where workers could make offerings for protection, success, or health,